These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, embodied resistance, the science and continuities of Africana fighting arts with Kamau Rashid. Africa World Now Project is next. The notion, assumption, and or idea that the various peoples who were enslaved during the periods and processes of the solidification of the racial global economy that claims our ancestors were deprived of culture, stripped of all associations with historical and ancestral groundings, is a product of centering European historicity as the dominant expression of social, historical, political, and epistemic knowledge systems. This argument is rooted in the fact that one of the most vibrant places to find the most articulate expressions of Africana humanity is in the way we resist injustice, inequity, violence, the way we conceptualize and engage in struggle against systems of oppression, the foundation of which is an advanced understanding of the praxis of being human. See everything Sylvia Wynter. Africana struggles operate on multiple and simultaneous levels of human existence. It always was, always will be, to realize a world beyond. The material and non-material praxis to balance forces seen and unseen. The science of Africana fighting arts, a commitment, conscious or unconscious, to embody resistance, of becoming a rebel. Building on the work of Dr. Kamau Rashid, I assert that becoming a rebel can be understood in the Swahili tradition Harakati Zawasi, translated as movement of rebels. For Dr. Rashid, it represents the tradition of radical resistance that is embedded in the history of capoeira and other African diasporic combat arts. These arts were used in the people's resistance to state oppression throughout the Americas. Harakati Zawasi seeks to honor these traditions by seeking to engage in the rigorous study and practice of the theoretical and technical applications of African combat systems. Additionally, Dr. Rashid and the collective seek to broadly disseminate these arts within the African community for the sake of facilitating cultural transformation. Today, embodied resistance, the science and continuities of Africana fighting arts with Dr. Kamau Rashid. Dr. Kamau Rashid is an associate professor of educational foundations and inquiry at National Louis University in Chicago. Kamau earned his PhD and BA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master of Arts degree from Northeastern Illinois University. Dr. Rashid's work focuses on African American history and culture, particularly on the intergenerational dynamics of Africana social critique, which includes an exploration and theorizing of W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as contemporary African-centered scholars and critical race theorists. Undergirding this, he studies art, hip-hop, and comics as a radical public pedagogy. He is co-developing an oral history and archival project focused on African American social movements in the Chicago area from the 1960s to the 1980s with Dr. Richard Benson of Spelman College, and is currently working on Finding Our Way Through the Desert, Jacob H. Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview, as well as the critical theory of W.E.B. Du Bois, The Struggle for Humanity. He has published a number of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and received various grant awards to support his work. Lastly, and most importantly, Dr. Rashid is active in a number of community organizations in the Chicago area, including the Kemetic Institute of Chicago, a research and educational organization focused on mapping, exploring, and applying the ancient contributions of Nile Valley civilizations. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela at Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Kamau Rashid. How are you doing, brother?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And thank you for taking the time to really talk about a very, very interesting but important conversation with a longer genealogy than I think that people really understand. And that is, when I say people, I'm talking across the board, across categories of associations, right? So, and the topic that we're actually going to be talking about today specifically is something that is called, or should be aptly called, African or Africana fighting arts. Mm-hmm. And this is something that, is near and dear to my heart. Growing up, playing different fighting games with my dad. He would come in the house late from work, and I'll be laying in my bed, just, waiting for him to come in because I knew we was going to have a battle. And my dad and I actually love to watch martial arts movies, the old school ones, like the mouth moving and the voice not matching up, and the classics, and also truth be told, there was a brother in our neighborhood who was a practitioner. Really piqued my interest because he would teach me outside of whatever he was doing as well, actually in the neighborhood, at the parks and stuff like that. So, it's near and dear to my heart. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in it. It's just, that's my association with the topic. Yes, but having also somewhat familiarity with the literature, I thought it would be important to have this conversation with you. Mm-hmm. And I want to approach this conversation in 3 different ways. And the first way, the first category that I want to approach this conversation is a discussion of its practice, or the fighting arts practice, its philosophies and its purpose in Africa itself, its origins, its combat traditions across the African continent, and also delinking the notion of martial arts from this limited perspective of an Asian, right? So I definitely want to be able to do that. And we really want to talk about this, in the context of, the origins of the practice itself of the fighting arts, because I think, again, its philosophy and its purpose is, the origins of African fighting arts becomes important. The combat traditions across the African continent, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, but I also want us to really dig into or address the delinking of martial arts from its limited perspective of being Asian in origin. Okay, that's the first category. The second category, and I'm going to go through these again because I know there's going to be a lot here. The second way I want to approach this critical conversation is through a discussion of embodied knowledge and memory in the diaspora, like movements. We talk about fighting arts, but the movements were also functional. It were not, they obviously had a purpose of protection and defense and offense, but there was something linked, obviously, to the universe, to nature as well. And the third one, which I think is probably a very interesting conversation, particularly in the context of this violence that's happening around us, the usefulness and necessity of understanding African fighting arts in the context of white supremacist violence. So to go back up, and then I'll let you dive into it, and we'll kind of map it. Let's deal with that first category, the discussion of the practice, the discussion of its origins, discussion of the combat traditions across the continent, and also delinking martial arts, or the notion of martial arts from its limited perspective. Dive right on in there, brother.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll start with the second part of that first in terms of the delinking, because I think one of the things that's interesting, I'm reading, I have this bad habit, I'm putting bad in quotation marks, habit of reading multiple books concurrently. And one of the books that I'm reading right now is a book, I think it's called Creating Wing Chun. And so it's a very good piece on the history of Wing Chun in terms of how it formed in Southern China in the 19th century. one of the things that's interesting that comes up in at the beginning of the book is this question around terminology, like how to refer to Chinese martial arts. And what was interesting is I thought about this, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while, is this idea of martial arts as a certain type of social activity is inextricably linked to the way in which most of us have come to encounter this idea. That most of us, the vehicle through which most of us have come to know of this thing called martial arts. And this is something that I've been hearing in different ways over the last really couple of decades, I guess decade and a half, for all the time I've been in this. I remember back in the 2000s, I would hear people like Ahati Kalindi Iyi would refer to the fact that when he would travel to Africa, that it would be, asking people to show you their martial art might receive the response to that might be looks of bewilderment. Instead, asking people how they stick fought or how they wrestled might be more efficacious, queries. Even my capoeira teacher, Mestre Pertuvello, we were talking recently. He was saying that even like in his time, he was saying that people who were around his age like had this idea of that martial arts constituted these combative traditions. But even if he were dealing with people that were older than him, for them, martial arts is something that's from Asia, right? And and I think what we're dealing with is this idea of martial arts as a signifier, right? Martial arts is a signifier that most of us, I guess, in this point, have come to encounter. Listen, when I say at this point, I'm talking like since the 1970s, from the 1970s and now, that most of us have come to know as a result either of mass media, particularly Hong Kong cinema to a large extent, secondarily the monetization, the commercialization of martial arts instruction, especially in this country, and maybe the third element of that would be and this is really over the last 30 years, but probably more significantly in terms of the last 20 or so, is the popularization of the mixed martial arts. And so inevitably, given that most of us have come to know of this thing as martial arts through this process of commodification of these combative traditions, I think it inevitably points us to Asia as the place where martial arts come from. And so this tension comes up in a lot of interesting ways. There's a colleague of mine who he in fact he was, I don't know if he was critical of me or critical of the idea of even calling African combat traditions martial arts, because he insisted that to refer to them in that term inevitably link them to this Asian conception of fighting. And so I appreciate that, because martial arts or these combative traditions or fighting traditions, as far as we can tell, these are culturally universal. As far as we can tell, everybody had modalities of combat. Dr. Edward Poe does in his book, he has a book about the combat arts of Northern Nigeria. And one of the things that he talks about, he provides these typologies of the combat arts in Northern Nigeria. And I think these typologies are actually useful for thinking about this range of social activity that we call martial arts today. He talked about arts where you have people fighting people, so it's scenarios where the adversary is another person. You have, and then he went into this idea, I think, where you have scenarios where the adversary is oneself, such as like the Fulani have a flogging ritual, and the idea is to again overcome one's own desire to avoid pain. And then he said there's scenarios where you have martial arts where people are essentially engaged in combat against nature, or the adversary is nature. And I think in that context, he was actually referring to Melanesian arts. But the point is that when we look around the world, we find different approaches to wrestling, different approaches to stick fighting, different approaches to boxing, or other types of combative games. So when we look at the African martial arts and their origins, what's interesting, I guess, if we start, I guess, as far back as we can start, right? In terms of where we have documented evidence. And of course, ancient Egypt would be that place, right? There's people often talk about Beni Hassan and how on the walls in Beni Hassan, you have all these renderings of wrestling. And again, a lot of these are, people will comment on the fact that these are moves that are still in wrestling today. It's kind of interesting. Well, let me say more. I'll say more about this, about wrestling in ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet, and then I'll come back to the present. So you have various stick fighting styles in Egypt. In fact, Tatib is a art with a long stick, or a nabut. And in fact, that art, their efforts today, in fact, to revitalize that art and was one of the interesting things that's happened with it is something that we see that's happened to many fight traditions around the world, not just Black fight traditions, but it's taken on this folkloric element. That is, fighting arts have a combative dimension, but many also take on this folkloric or performative dimension, and we certainly see this with Tatib. They had another, they had blade fighting arts. In fact, there's a brother in Austin, Texas, Demond Stith, who makes training weapons. And so just a couple of weeks ago, I got two wooden kopeshes. So the kopesh was a blade, was a curved blade from ancient Kemet. It almost kind of looks like a question mark in a way in terms of its shape. And they were very little. And when I got it in the mail, I was like, I texted the brother, I was like, are these built to scale? So he texted me back and he said, yeah, they are. And my son was nearby. My son, he was explaining, well, they were made of bronze historically, and bronze weapons are smaller because of the relative weakness of the metal. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm glad I got a scholar in the room to explain this to me. So that was edifying. But the point is that they had javelin throwing. I mean, they had boxing. The boxing is not very well documented. There are renderings of people in boxing postures and situations where people appear to be throwing blows, but we don't have a lot of information about it. The point is that we know in ancient Egypt they had fighting arts. And what we see throughout the continent, we see other types of fighting traditions. As far as I can tell, like when we look at Africa as a whole, we tend to find three different modalities of combat art. Wrestling, that is stand-up styles of grappling. Boxing, that is styles where people are striking with the hands, and in some cases the feet, and weapons arts where people are fighting with sticks, a lot of stick fighting, and in some cases blades, and how the orientation of the blades reflects a lot of diversity. One of the things that is interesting about how martial arts appear to be practiced throughout the continent is that, to a large extent, the arts themselves are within the domain of ethnic groups, and so the Nuba people of Sudan, for instance, have wrestling. And in fact, there's some people who speculate that their wrestling is in fact what the wrestling in ancient Egypt was like. But the reality is that when we look at most of the wrestling I'm aware of, whether we're talking about Lam, wrestling in Senegal, or whether we're talking about Igbo wrestling, it seems like the wrestling in much of Africa follows very similar rules, whereby if the person is thrown to the ground, they've lost. And I want to come back. I'll say something a little later on about maybe the possible purposes of that. But wrestling, you have wrestling arts, and I think it's fair to say that these wrestling that people have been wrestling on the African continent since time immemorial. The fact that we see parallels in terms of the philosophy, the type of rules or protocols pertaining to wrestling, is in and of itself very interesting, and perhaps may not be coincidental, right? It may have some significant implications in terms of knowledge transfer, at some point in the past. Who knows? But it is very interesting that, from East Africa to West Africa, we see this very interesting continuum in terms of the protocols of wrestling. The boxing arts, what's interesting. So, like, some people have speculated with respect to boxing in ancient Egypt because of some of the pictures. And again, it's not a lot of iconography, but some people have speculated that their orientation of boxing was one whereby one hand was used as a spear, sense of striking hand, the other hand was used as a shield. And you do find at least one group who sustained that an orientation of boxing that is basically spear and shield boxing, is what some of us have started to call it, which are the Hausa people in Dambe. And again, you have like one hand and it will be bound up in rope or some kind of fiber, and that's what's used for striking, and the other hand is used for parrying, sometimes for trapping and things like that. And again, it's hard to figure out, like, at least right now, I don't think anybody has definitively traced the origins of these things, but it's kind of fascinating when you look at this in contrast to the oral tradition of the Hausa, who speculate that they came from, I think, Western Eurasia, which is kind of interesting. You have so boxing, you find much more wrestling than boxing. Then you have other groups that have these stick fighting traditions. You go to Southern Africa, the Zulu, the Xhosa, there's definitely a spear and shield orientation of the boxing. One long stick serves as a shield, another stick is for striking, that's the spear. You find in present day Angola, there's a style of stick fighting, and I forgot what it's called, where it's a short, relatively short stick and it's held right in the middle. I'm not sure how it's used. I was just seeing a little bit of it in videos, but I wasn't able to make sense of what I was looking at. In Ethiopia, you have the Oromo stick fighting. It's very much like Tatib in Egypt, and so you have this long stick fighting. Just in the last couple of months, I just found out the Hausa have stick fighting, and it's really, really interesting because it's like what in China they call long pole fighting, where you hold the stick at the end and you're kind of sideways and you're striking with the tip of the stick. Again, one of the challenges I think is given the orientation towards the oral tradition in Africa. I think that may be that one might have to draw upon that as a source to understand like the beginnings of these traditions. But I think it's safe to say, especially with wrestling, that these are that some of these arts are arts that have certainly gone on since time immemorial. What the diversity of them I think demonstrates is, however, is that that combat arts appears to be a type of cultural universal. I don't really like that word universal, but it seems to be a very common adaptation of people to that circumstance. So for instance, like one of the things, like my capoeira teacher talks about this a lot, and I've heard others make similar points, is that in terms of speculating in terms of the genealogy of these arts, that it's quite possible that, for instance, like the wrestling styles, for instance, it's not without significance that the match ends when the person is tossed to the ground, and my suspicion has generally been that the first, in terms of I'll get into a little bit later on how these arts are situated as a type of social activity, but in terms of the origins of these things, one of the things that I generally presumed is that the wrestling, for all of the types of purposes that it serves in communal life, that it also served as a way of developing combative skills. If I'm on the battlefield, I throw my adversary to the ground, and if I'm armed with a blade, with the edged weapon, they're probably as good as dead anyway, right? Because they're in a far less defensible position, having been thrown to the ground, at least in terms of how combat appears to have been conceived in much of Africa. And so I generally had kind of presumed that this idea of putting the person on the ground, whether they were on their back, their side, whatever the case may be, was a sort of a signified. It was a symbol of defeat, of them having been defeated, in battle. Even when you look at and so one of the things that I think is the case, that I think many of these combat traditions derive from actual fighting, that is, actual military encounters of groups. I'll give two other examples of this. If you look at the style of stick fighting in Southern Africa, again, I mean, people are fighting with sticks, but if you read about Shaka and his process of developing the spear, utilizing the spear as a melee weapon rather than a projectile weapon, the use of the stick, for striking, is really just a proxy for the use of the spear, for stabbing, for thrusting, for slicing, and so on. And so it was clear that even in Southern Africa, and again, I mean, it's possible that the stick fighting tradition preceded that, but to me, I think I do suspect often that this is a way to train people, to enable people to sharpen their skills, because you do sharpen a lot of those skills in terms of how you block, how you parry, how you get openings, how you use your footwork, how you maneuver, and so on. So I think that a lot of these combat traditions, their roots may have been the traditions of warfare, and that these became mechanisms of training people for war. And in some cases, this is very, more or less explicit. Desh Obi, I know in his book Fighting for Honor, talks about this, how in the present day Angola, how for many of the groups from whom we inherit an art like capoeira, for instance, that their game Ngolo, which was the mother of capoeira and other arts in the diaspora, was a way of young men demonstrating their prowess, but also a way of training for war. One of the things that he writes, which was fascinating to me, he says that for many of the militaries in this region of Southwest and West Central Africa, that the infantry would not go into battle armed with shields. And so he speculates that the use of evasive movements was a way of surviving on the battlefield. Again, someone thrusts a blade at me, I avoid the blow and maybe return the thrust, rather than pairing with the shield. And so some have speculated that, and I think it's a reasonable, argument, that these arts were also mediums. They were mediums to refine people's capacity in war. But I think also because of the complexities of social life, and because to a large extent, I mean, certainly war is a part of social activity in Africa, just like any other part of the world. But it's only really under situations of duress that we find societies that were fully committed to the act of war. I'm thinking about Dahomey, in the 19th century, for example. But that's more of an anomaly, really, than anything else. And so, what happened during peacetime, which was really most of the time, if you look at the totality of African history, many of these arts took on dimension within the community, whether it was tools of manhood, parts of the manhood rights of different peoples, and so, like, in the stick fighting among the Oromo, Ngolo, and southwestern Africa, these were things in the traditional context that were used to demonstrate the mettle of young men, and they some things which would demonstrate their suitability to take a mate. You also had, like, in Sudan, and I forgot the name of the group. They have a style of fighting with wrist knives. So you put a blade on the wrist and you fight. The Hausa have this too, which is interesting. I don't know if the blades are the same, but one of the things that happens is that this is a ritual. Again, this is ritualistic combat. And so one of the things that will happen is that they'll engage in combat over the fields before planting. And the idea is to draw blood. And the blood is supposed to, enrich, the harvest. And so again, this is certainly, these are warriors who are giving their blood, but they're giving their blood not just for the sake of vanity, but for the sake of contributing to the community's well-being. So I think that when we look at the origins of these arts, I think the vectors are probably multiple, but I think it's plausible to say that the way in which people had to survive encounters, certainly with other groups, and also, of course, with nature, right? My teacher, he practices a Ethiopian stick fighting art called Dula Mekata, and he talks about how, in terms of some of he says that when he was learning it, I think from his teachers, he had learned that they would say that there were people in East Africa who were so proficient with the stick that they could, go up against a lion. Now, that's a lot of prowess, being able to take on a dangerous animal like this. So it's quite likely that these arts emerged in response to the challenges of nature, and then, of course, the perils posed by other human beings. But I think also a catalyst for the evolution was the need to institutionalize these arts in such a way so that they somehow optimize daily life. And I think the connections of them with various types of rights was a feature of that. And so, people talk about the martial arts, and a lot of people, they point to Asia as the birthplace of the martial arts, but that's really a problematic way of thinking. I think it's reasonable to presume that people the world over face similar challenges. Again, dangers from nature, dangers from other humans, and they develop means to respond to those.
So I wanted to pull on this thread because it was very interesting, because when you were talking and you mentioned this, but I want to pull on it, the context of war as being something. I mean, because again, when we think about war, we generally, that's even a distorted view, because, it's always conflict. But to be honest with you, that's a European construct, a way of looking at the world, because of tribal fights, before Europe became Europe.
Right.
And what is interesting here is in something that you said during peacetime, the ritual of combat arts, also being obviously linked to nature, right? So you also had to make sure that it was a social process of discipline. Could you talk a little bit more about the actually? Let's move into the idea of war itself, because sometimes people would think that it was just a mass extinction. You go to war, there was a mass extinction. Could you talk a little bit more of how war was implemented in the context of the fighting arts?
Yeah, I really appreciate that you asked that, because I think the challenge for Africans living in this part of the world is that European premises are presumed to be universal when they're anything but. Right. And I appreciate the more of us who are aware of that, the more it enables us to critically engage with the African practices, African worldview, and so on. So, when you think about, this idea, war existed certainly in the African continent, but I would argue that the way in which war was executed in many societies, traditional societies, as well as even civilizations, empires, kingdoms, that oftentimes the conception, the execution of war were quite different. The first example that comes to mind, I was thinking about, it was a documentary I saw a number of years ago. I think this is back in the 2000s. It was an old documentary then, if I remember correctly. Maybe it wasn't. It was a video of stick fighting in East Africa. So it was the Oromo stick fighting. And you had the men from one community and the men from another community.
We are currently listening to a recent conversation I had with Dr. Kamau Rashid, where we are exploring embodied resistance, the science and continuities of African fighting arts. Due to time constraints, you can listen to the entire program by accessing it through your favorite podcast platform. Search Africa World Now Project. Dr. Kamau Rashid is an associate professor of educational foundations and inquiry at National Louis University in Chicago. Kamau earned his PhD and BA from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and his Master of Arts degree from Northeastern Illinois University. Dr. Rashid's work focuses on African American history and culture, particularly the intergenerational dynamics of Africana social critique, which includes an exploration and theorizing of W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as contemporary African-centered scholars and critical race theorists. Undergirding this, he studies art, hip-hop, and comics as a radical public pedagogy. He is co-developing an oral history and archival project focused on African American social movements in the Chicago area from the 1960s to the 1980s with Dr. Richard Benson of Spelman College. He is currently working on Finding Our Way Through the Desert, Jacob H. Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview, and the Critical Theory of W.E.B. Du Bois, The Struggle for Humanity. He has published a number of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and received various grant awards to support his work. Lastly, and most importantly, Dr. Rashid is active in a number of community organizations in the Chicago area, including the Kemetic Institute of Chicago, a research and educational organization focused on mapping, exploring, and applying the contributions of ancient Nile Valley civilizations. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Continue to enjoy the program.
Stick fighting in East Africa. So it was the Oromo stick fighting. And you had the men from one community and the men from another community, and they met up and they were gonna go at it. And the purpose, the conflict was over water access. So they weren't, so it wasn't fighting, they weren't fighting to enlarge, their lands or fighting over the right to dominate another group. They were fighting over access to this particular water reserve. And in effect, they had decided they had established this protocol whereby these combatants from each group would fight, and the victors would have the rights. And this was a type of negotiation. It wasn't let's go over there and slaughter all those people. It was let's find some means that we can settle this conflict, and we'll go from there. So it's interesting, and it makes sense. And I also, when you were talking, I thought about warfare, particularly in the ancient Nile Valley. There's been this thing that's been happening where you have a number of white scholars who have been talking about the Black Pharaohs, and I'm amused by that term to no end. And of course, the relationship between Egypt and Nubia was a complicated relationship. It was a complicated relationship. But what's interesting is that when you look at the literature, and Mario Beatty has a wonderful paper about this in terms of how the conception of the Nubians was represented in the language in ancient Egypt, and what those terms signified. You had in terms of many white scholars have represented this idea of the Egyptian orientation, the Kemetic orientation towards the Nubians as being one of an oppressor, really, in the sense of what the British were in Ghana, in the Gold Coast, I should say, right, in the late 19th, early 20th century, this sort of idea of the occupying power, when it seems like the relationship was a lot more complicated than that, a lot more complex than that, especially given that these are civilizations who it would appear to have been engaged in exchange with each other for millennia. And certainly there were conflicts, but it's also very interesting that those conflicts did not result in the eradication of any of these groups. Those conflicts, in fact, did not result in the cultural erasure of either of these groups, which is very interesting. And so it does beg the question of how did Africans, even ancient Africans, conceive of war? I think one of the challenges that we have, even in terms of thinking about this, is much of what has happened on the continent over the course of the last 3 centuries has been distorted, right? It's been this framework of distortion. But if we look, like I'm thinking about the wars between Ashanti and Chita, that really led to the formation of the Ashanti Empire, and maybe some of the subsequent wars between Ashanti and Akwapim. These were wars that changed the balance of power, but these were that reordered power within those regions. But these were also not wars that sought to bring about the eradication of groups. That is, the people who established Chita, certainly their leaders were deposed, but the people themselves continued to exist. Even one of the oldest of the Akan empires, the Barong, those people were deposed, of course, by later groups, but they continued to exist. They exist today. You can go in central Ghana, and they're still alive. And so this African orientation to war was not one that, I think, in the sort of European sense, that one goes in and the idea is to just slaughter everyone. It seems that the scope of warfare in Africa was very limited. And I think, and my sense is that part of what may have been at the heart of that is this conception of humanity, right? I think that there was an orientation towards demarcating the scope of war relative to this conception of humanity, that is, that human life is valuable, and therein the focus of war being constrained relative to the objectives of war, whether that's in deposing a particular polity, whether that's preventing the expansion of a particular group, whatever the case may be. And again, it's not, and it's not to say that people did not lose their lives. They did. There was a loss of life in war. But I'm not aware of anything analogous in terms of the traditional and the classical African context that's equal to the war, the level of warfare, the scale of warfare, the intensity of warfare that really characterized much of European history, especially since the fall of the Roman Empire, but I guess since the rise of the Roman Empire. We're talking about a very violent history, and so it's very puzzling, in a lot of respects, that in the contemporary context, Africa is sort of the poster child, and Black people, not just people on the continent, but Black people, even Black people in the diaspora, the poster child of violence. When in fact, if you look at the totality of human violence over the last 1,000 years, there's a winner in that. There's a champion, and that champion is not Africa or the African world. So anyway, going back to the first example that I gave, though, and I'll give one last example, and I'll put this in a framework. One of the things that people talk about is how prior to Shaka developing I think it's asajai, the spear as a melee weapon as opposed to a projectile weapon, that much of the orientation towards warfare in Southern Africa was symbolic. That a show of force was what occurred, but there was significant constraints with respect to the loss of life. And I think that what that may illustrate is that within the context of the African society, warfare took on multiple dimensions. That is, that warfare could be real, that is, people engaging in open hostilities with each other, and warfare also being orchestrated in a symbolic form. And what's interesting about that, you actually have the continuation of that in the Americas. What's kind of interesting, the jogo de capoeira, the game of capoeira, could be an example of that symbolic war. When I was growing up, breakdance battles, I'm told by people a little older than me, that like in Chicago, there was a point where the gangs wouldn't even fight. They just show up and break dance against each other. That was before my time. But it's interesting, this idea of symbolic warfare as a way of mediating or as a way of resolving conflict. So I think the point here, I think, is that in the African context, war took on a number of forms, that it wasn't just open hostility, that resulted in the loss of human life, but war could also be orchestrated in symbolic fashion, which diminished the loss of life, but still gave an agreed upon framework for conceiving of whatever type of political or economic revision was being enacted, or affected.
No, that's a very important point because I mean, this human conceptualization, which is something that I am very much interested in and studying. It's, you know, in the context for me, in the context of resistance movements, but also in this contestation of human rights and you know, and this and conceptualization of philosophically of duties and responsibilities from indigenous African systems, which moves us to the second part of our discussion, which I wanted to talk about how what we just discussed transmitted itself or through embodied knowledge and memory to the diaspora. And you mentioned Capoeira, but I want to do something real quick before we do that. And I think this is important because I think it'll lead you into really talking about it, talking about this second component is, how did you yourself come to all of this knowledge or this particular form of discourse or knowledge system?
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and lead into this embodied knowledge. And again, here I'm thinking about because something you mentioned earlier, the adaptation to circumstances was something that, you know, may have caused conflict, or you had to negotiate through symbolic combat or do real combat. So now I'm thinking Africans being snatched from the continent, moving into, because this is going to get into the second part of this embodied knowledge that Africans, a lot of times we talk about culture and, you know, we talk about the artifacts of culture in Africa, but we don't talk about the fact that, you know, even in the Haitian Revolution, these people understood how to battle.
That's right.
You know, and even in the context of the of revolts against the plantation, they understood how to wage resistance.
Yep.
Before we really get into that, talk about how you came to all of this, and you mentioned your teacher a couple of times in Capoeira, but kind of jump on in there for me.
Yeah. You know, I throughout my childhood, you know, kind of like you, I used to go over my aunt's house, and me and my cousins would sit around watching kung fu movies, and so I wanted to learn, you know, the martial arts bad. And of course, you know, back then, this is like the late 70s, early 80s, really the thing that I knew of that was readily available was karate. But for whatever reason, you know, my mother wouldn't sign me up. I don't know, you know, after years later, she told me initially she told me that my stepfather didn't want me to learn. And then years later, she said, no, I didn't want anybody to hit you. And I'm like, people are jumping on me in school. There are people throwing blows, you know. So anyway, you know, I was very interested in the martial arts growing up, but not unable to study the martial arts. My stepfather and I would kind of box, and it wasn't like technical boxing, you know. And so I'm not sure if what we were doing was some kind of sort of folk orientation of boxing, or if it was, you know, just there's an interpretation of boxing. I'm not sure, you know, I never got a chance to figure out the genealogy, but it was pretty basic, you know, some basic strikes, some blocks and things like that. It wasn't anything very complicated. And so finally, when I got to college, I started studying the martial arts, and my first encounter was a eclectic art that blended elements of boxing, jiu-jitsu, judo, aikido, karate. So it was wrestling. So it was a mixed art. And it was in that time, I was in undergrad, and it was a brother that I knew, and he mentioned this art to me called capoeira. And he started doing the Jenga, and I didn't know what he was doing. It looked like he was dancing or something. And he mentioned this movie, Only the Strong. So I went home, I rented the movie, and I watched it. It was interesting, but at the same time, I didn't really connect with it. But I think it planted, you know, this idea in my mind, because even as a young adult, I was very much interested in us, very much focused on us, very much desirous of understanding our history and culture. And it was really not until that moment that this idea of African martial arts, that really wasn't something that I had really contemplated, had really pondered. And so it was at that moment, you know, where that idea was, I think, planted in my mind. And so at the end of the 90s, I was teaching at this, I was working at this community center on the south side of Chicago, and there was a group that taught a capoeira class at this park, probably about a half mile away, maybe a mile away from this community center. But the class was on the same day that I worked, so I couldn't get to the class. And so I was like, man, so I'm trying to figure out a way I can do this. I ended up in the interim studying this Chinese martial art, and then I ended up going back to get my doctorate back at the U of I in Champaign. Illinois. And while I was there, studied a couple of different Asian martial arts. There was the capoeira group there, but I didn't want to study with them because it was a primarily white capoeira group. And I've always had this issue about whites being the mediators of Black knowledge. That just always seemed unacceptable to me. So I kind of waited, but it finally, it was in the spring of 2005 where I was like, you know what, I'm gonna figure out a way to do this, because what had happened between 99 and 2005, not only had my desire to understand the African martial arts grown, but I even had actually, I think at that time around that time, I think I may have started a Yahoo group. So this is back when people were using Yahoo groups. It was called the African Warrior Tradition. I may have started it maybe in 2006, so it was a little bit after then, but I had become, in some ways an exponent of this thing, even though I was still looking for a way in. So finally, I ended up emailing, I don't know if I emailed or called Kalindi Iyi. I think I emailed him. I don't know how I got his email address, but Kalindi Iyi was, he passed away last summer. But Ahati Kalindi Iyi was probably certainly one of the biggest, I think, exponents of the African fighting arts. So I got in contact with him. He told me, this is spring 2005. He said, hey, well, I have a camp in Michigan in June. You're welcome to come. And I was like, oh, okay. So, I don't know how I got the money, because I was in grad school. I was broke, I was broke, and I was even more broke over the summer. If you haven't been in grad school, you don't know what that means, but the summers were lean, so I got my money together. I drove my little car up to Michigan, and that up there, I got some exposure. He has a stick fighting art he does. It's basically Tati, because it not boot. And I'd been working on that a little bit he had a video that he put out. I was kind of going along with that, but when I got up there, I got to get some hands-on instruction. And I also met a brother there named Mestre Petovella, also known as Dennis Newsom. And he was a capoeira teacher. And so that was really my first. No, that wasn't my first. I think that may have been my second lesson in capoeira, but it was the most thorough. I think before then, a brother I knew tried to show me a little bit, and I was like, this just feels weird. But that brother, he had showed me some, and that was my foundation. So I probably had this much knowledge in the African martial arts, but I was determined to run with it. And so my goal really at that point so that was June 2005. My goal at that point was really to make this a way of life. I was already committed to the martial arts from the 90s, from when I first started training in the Asian martial arts back in 94. And so for me, martial arts was a way of life. It was something that I was committed to, but I really wanted to immerse myself very deeply in these African arts. And I think for me, and this is something that I became more consciously aware of during that period, like from 2000, just before then. So I want to say maybe about 2002 to the end of that decade, it became clear to me increasingly that whereas I appreciated like the technical efficiency of an art like Wing Chun, where I appreciated the sort of history and the philosophy of an art like Chole Foot is one of the Chinese arts that I picked up. I felt throughout that time a certain degree of alienation, whereas I appreciated the history and the philosophy of these arts. They also were someone else's history. They were also someone else's philosophy in a lot of respects. And for me, the question inevitably returned to, and it was the same question that a 7-year-old asked me 3 years ago. He said, Baba, how do Africans fight? And I didn't phrase it like that, but that was the question in my mind. Like, how do Africans fight? And moreover, the other part of that question, and how did those fighting arts inform what we did over here relative to our experience? And so I moved to St. Louis in 2006. So this is a year after I go to that camp. And I was looking around because I figured I'm in a city now. I was in Champaign, Illinois before. I think I'm in a bigger city. I should be able to find a capoeira group. Eventually, I found this brother named Teboho. At the time, he was with a capoeira group called Coragem Oro. And I trained with their brother. I don't know how many times I went per week, but I was training with their brother every week. I was like, I'm going to get this, and so I was doing that. I was also practicing that stick fighting art. Basically, it's Tati, but Hati Kalindi referred to as Nabut. And those are my arts, and so one of the things that I began to do, that I became interested in, was not only learning these arts, but popularizing them. So like I said, it was around that time I started a Yahoo group called the African Warrior Tradition. Again, I had this much knowledge about the African arts, but I was an exponent, I invited I was a professor at St. Louis Community College at the time. And on at least two occasions, I was able to bring somebody. I brought a Hati Kalindi E down, I want to say in 2007. And then in 2009, I brought a brother named Mestre Terry Baruti in, who teaches capoeira in, I think, I think he's in San Francisco, but basically the Bay Area in California. And he came in with two of his country mestres, and it was right on time, because these brothers, one of the things that was a challenge for me with capoeira was, and this is going to go back to something I mentioned earlier, much of capoeira has been reduced to the folkloric, or to the level of symbolic combat. And so this explicit articulation of capoeira as a combat art, as a type of, people like the term martial science. I'm not the biggest fan of that word, but people will use that term. That is one thing, something that I was always looking for. Like because when you read these accounts, when I was still in Champaign, this is even before 2005. Again, I was reading this stuff. I didn't have the access to instruction, but I'm studying. I found Desh Obi's master's thesis, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, this is what, it was an account in there. This is from the Southern U.S. This is on Sunday. On Sunday, Black folks was often left to their own devices. And so the plantation owner finds out that the Black folks are off, and they off having a good time. And he's like, he sends the overseers to go break up this gathering. And they go over there, they get beat down. And when they get back, they was like, yeah, that dude, he was there and he wasn't having it. And basically, Dash Obi, the speculation was that this was one of the brothers who was knowledgeable in these African arts, because he sure didn't learn no karate, but he knew how to fight. So what was it he was fighting with? And so it was texts like those that made me very desirous of getting this knowledge. And so at any rate, I'd become an exponent. And so I bought those two brothers down. And again, Mestre Tori Baruti, one of the things that I appreciated about what they presented capoeira as a combat science. And so that was something that I was greatly appreciative of. When I got back to Chicago, this 2009, I was again kind of in this liminal space. I wanted to continue my study, but also realized that I had like limited resources in terms of information. And that was a constant source of frustration. And really what's clear to me is that from 99 all the way into the 2000s, 2010s, really this idea of not having information was a source of frustration. There were a couple of things that were happening. Like 52 Blocks was now much more visible on the scene. 52 Blocks of jailhouse boxing. And I knew of it from back in the 2000s, but hadn't seen anybody who was teaching it. And so on. And so throughout the 2010s, there's sort of this gradual expansion, I think, for me in terms of just access to information. And really not even throughout the 2000s, it's probably like in the latter half of this decade. What happened in 2011, I ended up teaching capoeira at the request of this a parent in this homeschool group that my children were a part of, that my family was a part of, really. And I didn't really feel that I was qualified to teach capoeira. But they wanted knowledge, and I said, well, I'll share with them the capoeira that I know. But what was interesting is that after that, I kept falling into situations where people were inviting me to teach capoeira, and so I was like, well, if people want me to teach this thing, let me share what I know. And eventually, I was clear that I needed to know more of this. I need to go deeper into this art, and so finally in 2017, I got a grant. A research grant from the university that I work for, National Louis University, a SEED grant. And what I wanted to do was study African martial arts as African-centered pedagogy. That was the idea. And so what I was going to do is to host 3 events. I actually started in the summer of 2016. I brought Dr. Edward Poe to Chicago. He's a brother. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin. He studied with Mr. Pastinha in Bahia back in the late 1960s. So he taught a workshop. There was another brother at the time. He was with this other capoeira group. I studied with him a little bit back in 2014. He came and taught in the fall, I think, of 2016. And then in 2017, I brought in Damon Stith from Austin. He taught some African stick and blade fighting, little 52 Blocks, little capoeira. And then in May of that year, brought Mr. Petrovella, my capoeira teacher. And it was interesting because, again, this is the first brother that I really, this is brother really who I got my formal introduction to capoeira with, and I've stayed in contact with him throughout that whole time. And so, when he's here, I'm looking at this brother, and I'm like, this is the person I need to be studying with. And all this time, I've been telling myself that it really wouldn't be feasible for me to take on a teacher, who wasn't in the region, wasn't in the Midwest, because I was like, the economics of it won't work out. But I said, you know what, I'm gonna just figure it out. So I asked the brother if I could learn from him, and I've been studying with him ever since. And so that was my, and from him, I've learned capoeira, Makulele, which is the stick fighting that you see in capoeira, Kalinda, which is an African American stick fighting, and so on. And since then, and more recently, I've been studying with Professor Mo and 52 blocks. Again, I had a little bit of 52 blocks from different people, who would show me different things over the years, but this brother enabled me to take a deep dive. And so that's been my path in these arts to the present.
No, and that's important, because what's happening here is going to what you just demonstrated in your answer is the idea of embodied knowledge, and and how memory is carried over through movement, not only through thought but also through, which goes back to this notion of memory and being brought over, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about, we went over the history, when we went over the origins of that. But now let's talk about it in a specific, and let's look at it through capoeira. Let's look at it through the origins of capoeira and how it, was that particular form, did it evolve, or was it something else before it came across, the body of water, the Atlantic Ocean? How did that develop, and how much of it is similar to the ancient styles or the other styles across the continent, or is it an amalgamation of different forms?
Yeah, it's a very good question. One of the things that's, like, if you look at the data, I think it's roughly 35%, a little less than 35% of enslaved Africans brought to this country came from the Congo, Angola area, and it looks like, whenever you look throughout the Americas, wherever you had these significant populations of these blacks from the Congo, Angola region, you have a capoeira-like art, right? An art derived from Ngolo, which is this fight dance tradition of that part of Africa. So in the Americas, in Brazil, that Ngolo becomes capoeira. In Cuba, it becomes Juego de Mani. In this country, it becomes knocking and kicking. In Martinique, it becomes one part of the country Laja, and another part of the country Danmie, and it becomes things in other places. What's interesting, again, this is like, again, we're moving to the West, but what's also interesting is if you go to the East, you find, especially places like some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, you find arts, merengue, and that there's different styles of merengue boxing, I think like a Reunion Island and so on, that are very capoeira-like, and so it's very interesting in terms of the movement of this art, and I think many people have argued, and if you've had different arguments. Let me say this: you've had one argument advanced by white Brazilians that capoeira was created in Brazil. In fact, they've even gone so far as to say that it was not only created in Brazil, but it was created by the various ethnic groups or racial groups that inhabit Brazil. We can think of this as the de-Africanization of capoeira, which should not surprise us, given that the cultures of Black people are appropriated the world over. You've had, Dr. Edward Poe wrote a nice essay about this called The Origins of Capoeira, and what he does in his essay, which I really appreciate, not only does he link capoeira to this tradition of Ngolo from the Congo Angola area, but he also talks about the aspects of capoeira that make it African. For instance, capoeira is practiced in a circle. You find with other African fighting traditions that the practice of these traditions occurs in a circle. You have the accompaniment of music and song. So music and song is a part of the tradition. People are singing, people are playing instruments. So you have all these different African cultural elements that are embedded in the art. You also have the use of quote unquote magic. In Brazil, that's mandinga. But you have traditions like this in other parts of Africa, like in Senegal, the wrestlers. In fact, I'll use an example from northern Nigeria with Dambe boxing. People will often, go and see someone who'll give them, some type of a pouch with something, maybe like a Quranic verse, for instance. But this is being used as a type of magic. Like there's one type of magic to make the person. Dr. Poe was just telling, he was reminding me of this a week ago. There's a type of magic that is supposed to make the person fall into a hole when you go to fight them. So basically you go to fight them and they just fall down like they fell in a hole. And so you have these traditions of of magic, again, quote unquote magic or music, is this practice in a circle, this embedding of the practice in community. And it just so happens that capoeira has all these things. And, some people say if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And I think that's not an unreasonable way of thinking. But the point is that, yeah, I mean, these arts emerge in the Americas. Now, when you look at the video of Angola, like of Ngolo, you see, like, to me, when I look at it, I see elements of capoeira. I see things that you see in capoeira. I see some of the kicks. I see some of the so-called acrobatic movements. But what I think has happened, I think the art, because of the environment, I think the art evolved, and again, I don't really like that term, but I think the art was adapted to that place and the circumstance that Black people found themselves in that place. Because when you look at others of these arts, like you can look at Danmie, that's probably the other most visible example, the other most visible daughter art of Ngolo. You also see, again, a lot of movements that you find in capoeira, but you also, within that, you see significant differences, significant stylistic differences in terms of how movements are executed, what types of movements are executed. And so it's clear that a type of adaptation occurred in each of these places. And I guess the last thing I'll say, like our style of capoeira, the one that we practice in our group, Os Melandros de Mistrituro, is a capoeira from Rio de Janeiro. And it's dissimilar in a lot of important ways from the capoeira of Bahia. So it's clear that even in a place like Brazil, capoeira took different developmental trajectories in each of those places relative to the needs of people in that place.
And it's very interesting that you talk about that, because I take students to Brazil, and we actually, let me be clear, we take to Bahia. We go to El Salvador, Bahia, and we actually talk about, we have masters come in to talk about specifically its origin, capoeira as practice in Bahia. And one of the things that they say is that you find the relationship of the practice in relationship to the land, geography, to the access, which goes back to a very important question. The reason why I think that this notion of our discussion is now in the category of embodied knowledge and memory is because, again, the evolution of the art, the evolution of the way that we understand the world evolved based upon the access to resources, to geography, but also the energies in these particular places as well, because it's something that you talked about that I think is very important is the idea of magic, the idea of spirituality, the idea of spirit that Africans understood. So could we say that honing one's skill in the context of a fighting art, even during times of peace, was also connected directly to one's relationship to the land, the universe, and other people, a spiritual, because you mentioned this fight, not only do you the three areas of fighting: nature, other folk, but also oneself, right? So that embodied knowledge, which is also can be linked to probably why, when you talk about Christianity, you talk about the unorthodox religious practices and the orthodox religious practices that filter themselves through the Americas, through to Chicago, you know what I mean? It's like this prism that produces many different ways of understanding, but it all is coming from one particular original way or origin, that practice itself. Could you talk a little bit more about, because I'm always fascinated, but also very locked in when we hear, these notions of magic, these notions of spirit. I'm thinking of Malidoma Some's work in Of Water and Spirit, because he talks about these particular. So we have these traditions, magic, and ancient Egypt was very important. Could you talk a little bit about those links there?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was talking to Hati Kalindi one day, and he said something very interesting. He said that, he was saying that in traditional societies, it wasn't like today where you go to wherever you do your religious, a spiritual practice one day, and then you go to the gym the next day, and then you go do the martial arts the next day. He was saying that people's lives were much more continuous, or there was greater continuity with respect to those things. And oftentimes, in the medium of one's, let's say, combative practice, it became a facilitator of those things. And I thought that was very interesting, because I think one of the things that we see throughout the African continent is that, and throughout in the diaspora, is a consequence with respect to these arts, that these arts are embedded in the social fabric in very interesting ways. So for instance, I mentioned Dambe boxing earlier. Again, Dambe boxing is the boxing art of the Hausa in northern Nigeria and southern Niger. Well, one of the interesting things about this I didn't mention earlier, Dambe is the art of the butchers. So this isn't just just any old body, boxes. But traditionally, this is art that was associated with people who had a certain type of craft in the community. One of the types of, again, magic that is a part of this context, again, in northern Nigeria as well, is this idea of people who are so connected to metal, so connected to metal, not just in a physical sense, but on a spiritual level, and that they'll do certain things to prevent themselves from being cut with the blade. And so you've probably seen these videos where these guys are just rubbing the knife on their skin and nothing penetrates their skin. I was talking to Dr. Edward Poole a week ago, and he was saying that when he was living in Nigeria, he had a problem where every time he would cut things, he would cut himself. So he would, he'd buy meat, he'd go home and cut it, he'd end up cutting himself. And he said that one day he mentioned this to someone, they said, oh, you just need to get this leaf. And he's like, yeah, okay. So he goes and gets the leaf, and the next time he's cutting the meat, he cuts right on top of his, I think it was his thumb. And he closed his eyes and looked away. He's like, oh my gosh, I just cut off my thumb. And he looks and it was not, it was there, just a little line. What's interesting is that that's in Brazil. They call it corpo fechado. Corpo fechado. It's what Besouro, was supposed to have had. Besouro was a legendary capoeirista who lived in the early 20th century. And the idea is that because he had the corpo fechado, or the closed body, nothing can penetrate his skin. Not bullets, not knives, nothing. That basically he was invulnerable, and it was only the wood from a particular type of tree that could hurt him. And what I think is particularly rich about this is that I think it illustrates the extent to which in the African cultural imagination, these arts became means of signifying the transcendent capacity of each individual person, right, of each person. That is, that in this art, you embody not only your own capacities, but you embody things bigger, greater than yourself, right? So it's not without incident, it's not without significance, I should say, that like even in northern Nigeria, I think they do this in Senegal too with the wrestlers, like they'll go in with like a Quranic verse in a pouch, because the idea is to acquire the power from this thing, and within that to augment their own power, to transcend the limitations of their physical ability. It's very much akin to how people describe ritual possession in West African spiritual systems. And then there'll be accounts where they'll say that it was an old person who was possessed by a deity, and they began to do all these fantastic things that they ordinarily wouldn't be able to do. Again, they were able to transcend physical limitations within the medium of a certain type of spiritual practice. And so I think that what that reveals, again, going back to this idea of these arts as embodied knowledge, not only do they embody a certain type of historical knowledge, because they do that, they certainly relate this very interesting continuity of knowledge, and just to go further into that, I mean, you look at some of the very famous mestres, the two most famous, Mestre Pastinha and Mestre Bima, both who say their teachers were from the African continent. Their teachers weren't born in Brazil; their teachers were born in Africa. So much for this idea that capoeira is not from Africa. In fact, even my teacher, he was telling me the other day that in our lineage, one of the masters in our lineage was taught by a man named Artur Medio, who also says that his teacher came from Africa, which is, and of course, it does beg the question of how ubiquitous stories like that are within the history there. So not only are these arts embodiments of a certain historical understandings, they're also embodiments of spiritual traditions. They're also embodiments of certain kind of protocols. Like one of the things which is interesting, and this is a problem, many of these arts are in danger of dying. Like right now, I mean, like the derivative of Ngolo in this country, knocking and kicking. Some people speculate that art may be dead, because if you look at the accounts of it, and Deshobi, I think, is probably written about it more than anyone else. It was transmitted within the family. And I have 3 children. I teach them martial arts, but but it's not always easy. Sometimes people don't want to train. And so I thought about that. Like if I were to add up the cumulative martial arts knowledge that I acquired, will I be able to transmit the totality of that to any one of them? I don't know, because I can of course compel people to do things, but a certain amount of desire, a certain amount of interest certainly augments one's capacity to and one's desire to retain knowledge. And so many of these arts, whether it's Kalinda in this country, or knocking and kicking in this country, or whether it's some of these Afro-Caribbean stick and blade fighting arts, many of these arts are endangered. And part of the reason why these arts were transmitted in such intimate contexts to the family is because they inherited the African tradition of secrecy, that all knowledge is not for everybody. And so, yeah, I mean, these arts in so many ways embodied historical, spiritual, philosophical, and even organizational modalities that derive from the African tradition. To say nothing of the sort of political impulse embedded in many of these arts with respect to resistance.
I can't help but think about maroon communities in the context of all of this. You know, especially being able to understand the direct connection to nature and the direct connection to being able to, and secrecy. I was just thinking about this and having a conversation the other day about, you know, this notion that you just talked about, you know, this idea of secret knowledge or sacred knowledge, we should say, and being transmitted to people that can protect its genealogy. It's not necessarily secret in the context that it should not be shared, but you should be prepared to be able to receive it in order to move it along. You know, and again, I just can't help. I mean, I'm kind of projecting myself back into history, being like, oh man, what would have been like, you know, to be there to see maroons, right, across in the Americas, you know, just dodging, you know, moving in silence and moving in secret, but also banging on the system, that plantation system, right? Using these arts, using these things.
I'll just say a little bit. You know, I was I'm finishing up a book now by Jacob H. Carruthers, and the last chapter in that book looks at his essay, The Irritated Genie, his essay on the Haitian Revolution, and I'm always struck by one of the points that he makes in that book is that the French were they were befuddled by the Maroons. I mean, he said that the French would circulate this rumor that the Maroons could disappear into thin air because they stand there and they shoot and the Maroons would be there, but once the smoke cleared, they were gone. They were like, what is it these black people are doing? You know, and of course the Maroons had developed, he said, like one of the things that they had is a technique where they could shoot, because you know, back then the guns had to be manually reloaded. They said they could shoot, move, and reload, and then come up and fire without standing still. So they'd fire, start moving while they're reloading, come back up and fire again. And the French were just like, what are they doing? And so these black folks applied their cultural genius to the technology they had at their disposal to wage war for liberation. And so there was this tactical knowledge. And even now, there's this tradition of Haitian machete fighting, you know, which continues to exist. And so happily, I mean, many of these traditions live on.
I actually just saw a video of the machete fighting, particularly in Haiti. It's you know, it's survival, and it's one of the most fascinating and one of the most I like to consider myself. I play basketball and I like to consider myself athletic, but don't put a machete. I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to step into that arena. You know, particularly at this particular point, but as we kind of close, man, you know, this conversation is, you know, hopefully our listeners, and I'm sure our listeners are getting, you know, a lot out of this particular conversation. But as we kind of close, let's move into our third component or a third category, which is the usefulness or the necessity in this current iteration of white supremacist violence. And I say current iteration because, again, we've just went through some history, and if people understand that Black folk have always been resisting, but also practicing these arts, what about today? How does this look? What is the usefulness? What is the usefulness in the context of the or the necessity today?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I tell my students, so like we have in Chicago, we have a male rites of passage program called Open Rites of Passage Society, and I'm one of the founders of that group. And one of the things that I do with the youth, among other things, that I teach them some of these arts. So usually capoeira, 52 blocks. I've taught them some stick fighting. And one of the things that, you know, a number of them, they train in other modalities, you know, besides what I show them. And so one of the points that I've made with them is that I've said that there are three pathways to the African arts. One of those pathways is to practice the arts themselves, whether it's capoeira, whether it's 52 blocks, whatever it may be. The other thing that I've said is another pathway is to take elements of these arts, you know, maybe a technique that I show you and add it into your existing repertoire. And the third is to embrace the philosophy of the African warrior tradition. By that I mean, and I'll you get to that, your question with this, what we find is when we look at African thought, there are a number of deep and profound discourses around warriorhood, around the type of disposition requisite for the confrontation of danger. And I think those ideas emerge in the traditional society for a reason. I think those ideas have a lot of meaning and significance to us here, because I think we've seen the retention of those ideas. There's the Yoruba sacred text, the Odu Ifa, there's one that says, the constant soldier is never unready, even once. Black folks say that all the time in America. They don't say it like that. They say, what is it? Stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Yeah, you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. Exactly.
Right.
Ancient knowledge right there. Ancient knowledge.
Ancient knowledge. So I think a lot of these ideas we've kept with us. But yeah, to our current situation. Yeah, I mean, we're in a very, very volatile situation. I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about the type of political transition and economic transition we're seeing around us. But my point is that I would argue these arts have a profoundly significant tradition. First of all, they situate us. First of all, they seek, among other things, to give us the orientation of the warrior, the perspective of the warrior, the mindset of the warrior, the disposition of the warrior, right? Where we move from an orientation of being potentially victims of violence to where we see ourselves as having the capacity to defend ourselves, to defend our families, to defend our communities. And so I think the first thing that is important about these arts is the psychological dimension. That is how they change how we think about ourselves, how we think about the possibility of danger. I think we have the capacity to think differently about danger when we know we have the capacity to see ourselves. I think the second thing that they do is that they ground us in a type of they reinforce and ground us in a type of consciousness of who we are, and I think that's especially meaningful when we talk about white supremacist violence, because the response to an individual act of provocation becomes symbolically takes on a response to a genealogy of violence, right? And so I'm not just engaging in combat against this person, I'm engaging in combat against a tradition of the dehumanization of African people, and that is intolerable, right? And so I think it also situates us or positions us with respect to that. And I think the third thing, which is also important, is that it gives us a technical repertoire. It gives us a technical body of knowledge, whether it's how to fight with an edged weapon. I mean, you were mentioning the whole thing with Haiti. I'm always bothered when I look at those videos of the Haitian machete fighting and I see these Haitian masters teaching white folks. And I'm bothered because this is what they use to defeat white folks. Black folks are still at the bottom of the power hierarchy of the planet Earth. And I'm not saying that the machete is the central weapon to changing and rebalancing that particular power hierarchy. But I am saying that war is not over, right? This situation that we're in still exists, that a war is still being perpetrated against us. In the context of Haiti, it takes the form of what used to be called structural adjustment or neoliberalism or deposing, democratic elected leaders for the sake of putting in puppets from the U.S. State Department and other entities. I don't think we're in a situation where we can relinquish our warrior traditions to others. I just, maybe I'm myopic in that way. And so I think that these arts also reflect those bodies of knowledge, whether it's, esgrima con machete, which is again this Afro-Colombian style of machete, and also stick fighting or stick fighting from Trinidad, Kalinda, whether it's capoeira. I think these arts also give us a technical repertoire. One of the things that my teacher talks about, and is that my capoeira teacher, Mr. Petrovello, which I really appreciated, is he embeds all three of those things within a single framework. Like one of the things he has is I have a working document of different things that he'll say, and I'll type them down, I'll put them in the document. And one of the things he says is capoeira finds order in the chaos, which I find interesting. Capoeira finds order in the chaos. And so I think about that relative to, in a combat situation, one mustn't lose one's head, right? One has to stay cool. One has to stay vigilant, and one has to clearly assess the dangers and possible dangers as well as avenues of escape. When you train, you develop, right, that kind of awareness, both as a necessary element of that training, but also as a byproduct of that training. So whether finding order in the chaos is anticipating danger, whether finding order in chaos is nullifying danger, whether finding order in chaos is circumventing danger, the point is you develop that capacity. And I think that our people in America, if we had an understanding that the type of predation that's historically visited upon African people has never paused, has never stopped, has not ceased, but in fact is continuing in different forms. So unfortunately, we're moving into an era of heightened political violence. I think that should be an indicator of the need for all of us to take our personal safety, our communal safety much more seriously. And to that end, I think training, I think it gives us a certain technical skill set. I think it gives us a certain resolve, but I think it also orients us to an understanding of the political significance of these acts, as well as the political implications of our resistance to them.
Very well put. And I was thinking particularly in the context, when we talk about, these meditations on life, or our philosophies, or the enhancement of the philosophies of life through movement.
Yeah.
And ancient Africans across the African continent understood that it unlocks paths in the body, paths through connection, through nature, the spirit, other beings, but also the universe, because that's what we really are talking about here, the movement that Africans understood. And we're talking, communities of African people across the continent understood this and brought this with them. This, again, this embodied knowledge. No, that was a great way to really encapsulate. I guess probably listeners was like, how are you going to answer this particular question? You know what I mean? But it's a very, very important meditation on this question. But I think obviously our listeners should think deeply about this. Did you want, I'm sure people are going to want to be able to, I'm not sure if you wanted to provide any information on how to get in contact with you. I can do that myself because maybe people want to learn those 52 blocks, man.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago and I've, been teaching, so I'm teaching capoeira in Chicago. I've been teaching capoeira in Chicago for a while. So my website explicitly for the capoeira class is chicagomalandros.com. So that's Chicago and then Malandros, MALANDROS.com. So chicagomalandros.com. And that where you can get information about the capoeira class. Our group, Os Malandros de Mestruturas, in some other cities. So if you're in Atlanta, if you're in LA, if you're in Dallas, if you're in Austin, and if you're in San Diego, it's Malandros in those cities. So if you hit me up and my contact information is on the site, I can put you in contact with them. And 52, yeah, I've been, teaching mainly youth, but people have been asking me about an adult class. So in March, I'm going to launch I call it integrated African fighting arts class. So a little 52, some stick fighting, some capoeira, and some other things. But also I teach. So with 52 Blocks. My teacher, Professor Mo, has put together a group called the 52 Blocks Federation, and they're teachers in the federation of the cities. There's a brother in Miami, Professor Mo is in New York, and it's folks in other places. So if you hit me up again, I can let you know where you might be able to connect with somebody. And certainly, and if there's nobody around, I definitely am always willing to share what I know with our people.
Thank you very much, brother. I really appreciate this conversation. And you actually gave me a third idea of another conversation that we're going to have. And we talked about one off camera, but this third conversation is going to be, on your book about Jacob Carruthers.
So, yeah. I'd love to talk about that.
But again, thank you so much for your taking the time to talk with us today.
You know what? And I forgot the website where I talk about 52 and the other arts is hzwmartialarts.com. So H as in house, Z as in zebra, W as in wind, martialarts.com. So that's where I talk about all the arts, 52 and so on.
Again, thank you so much, brother.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
I want to show you what heaven looks like. I want to show you what heaven looks like, 'cause I've seen it before. Down the stairs, as it was, thought it wasn't. Sad it found you and I, broken down and sore. There was a golden ride.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today. I look forward to spending time with you next week. We could be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ, or Instagram at Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project collective consists of international media journalists, executive producer and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project's media correspondent Funa Ngonda. Senior Research, Content Contributor, and Production Director, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Senior Research and Content Contributor and Production Associate, Dr. Josh Myers. Associate Producer and Content Contributor, Dr. Keisha Codd Perry. Technology Advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology. And Creative Director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on SoundCloud and Spotify podcasts. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, above all, be intelligent.